Welcome. Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks for joining us today. I'm very excited about this conversation about autonomous vehicle access, which is what this panel session is going to be about, and particularly this question about how we can ensure that all communities will benefit from this acceleration towards autonomous vehicles. We don't know exactly what the future holds, and I think that there's a lot of exciting things about the future of autonomous mobility, but I think there's also understandably quite a lot of apprehension and concerns about what the rollout could look like. So I'm very excited to talk and be joined by this panel where we'll highlight key considerations to ensure program planning and implementation will expand access to new technologies. I would love to go ahead and I'm joined today by Dr. Shelley Francis with EV Noir, Dave Rubin with Cruise, and Kurt Estradka from VHB. Welcome all, thanks so much. My name is Amanda Howell. I'm a researcher with the Urbanism Next Center in Portland, Oregon with the University of Oregon. I would love to go ahead and just invite everyone to share a few words about your background, the work that you do currently, and in particular, what what type of work you're doing around autonomous mobility and autonomous vehicles. So Dave, why don't we go ahead and get started with you?
Perfect. Thanks, Amanda. Great to be here today, and thanks for all the work that you've put into facilitating today's conversation. So, hi, everybody. My name is Dave Rubin. I am the head of policy research working for a company called Cruise. We are a fully shared, self-driving, and fully electric car company based in San Francisco. We have a number of strong partnerships with traditional OEMs as well as technology companies. We're majority owned by General Motors, but also have been working with Honda as well as Microsoft, Walmart, a few others in the space. And to get kind of a better sense of our technology and our company, so we have about 150 vehicles on the road today in San Francisco, again, fully autonomous. Those vehicles are operating on the Chevrolet Bolt platform, but we have developed another vehicle called the Cruise Origin, which is no steering wheel, no pedals, and that will really be kind of the flagship and cornerstone of our future commercial service. And we plan on operating as a ride-sharing platform, very similar to Uber and Lyft, but of course without the driver, apropos of today's panel. And a couple of interesting notes as well. We're the first autonomous vehicle company to commit to an electric fleet. All of our vehicles are electric on the road today. And we are also the first to power our fleet with renewable power. I'll talk about that later today, but we source that energy right from family farms in the Central Valley within California. In terms of my role and work on the government affairs team, the role of policy research is really interesting when it comes to autonomous vehicles. And this is borrowing a phrase from Dan Sperling, who some of you might be familiar with, but I like to think about my role as kind of adding science to policy and really kind of looking at ways that we can collectively advance strategies that allow us to kind of, unlock the benefits of autonomous vehicle technology. And that includes work with community leaders and partners, CBOs, researchers and universities and policymakers. And really those policy impacts that I'm exploring and advancing are across the board, from emissions and sustainability to road safety, congestion, accessibility, and of course, environmental justice and equity. So I'll leave it there and pass it perhaps over to Dr. Francis.
Good afternoon, everyone. So glad to be here. So Shelley Francis, co-founder and managing partner of EV Noir, which is a technology mobility solutions organization that's focused on shared, connected, electric and autonomous vehicles. So our work focuses really on two areas of work: e-mobility best practices and then e-mobility diversity, equity, and inclusion. My background is former medical school professor that specializes in environmental public health disparities. And I'm also serving in the role as the national board director for the Electric Auto Association. Also the co-founder of EV Hybrid Noir, which is the nation's largest network of diverse EV drivers and enthusiasts. You saw some of our members on some of the panels yesterday, as well as just now on the marketing panel. So we've been working with the 25 largest cities and municipalities around mobility solutions and their decarbonization efforts. And so we want to work on solutions and strategies that really address their mobility needs and meeting them where they are. So this is we do this with a focus on utilizing mobility best practices, as well as utilizing e-mobility, diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of this conversation. And obviously, we also have a working relationship with Cruise Automation, and we'll speak to the research that we facilitated with them a little further in our presentation or in our discussion today.
Great, thank you, Shelley. And Kurt, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Really excited to hear from the other panel members. My name is Kurt Ostraka. I'm the Director of Smart Communities for VHB. I'm located in Orlando, Florida. I have some exciting news to tell you about what we're doing down here. About a year ago, we completed what's called the Future Ready City Master Plan, which is Orlando's version of a smart city master plan. So the idea was to leverage innovation and technology and partnership collaborations to enhance the city's services and investments. This was a grassroots-led plan. We spent a lot of time in the community trying to understand first what were the main concerns and challenges that residents felt that the city was facing over time. So rather than starting with a technology solution already in mind and predetermined, we said, let's start and make sure we establish the problems we're trying to solve and then find the right type of technology to plug into it. So with that plan, we did a prioritization to come up with our short and mid and long-term strategies. And part of that was, of course, a mobility focus area. If you've been to Orlando, you probably know that you have to get a rental car just about to go anywhere. And that our bus service is not as robust as it could be. We do have light rail now, or commuter rail, but really we're still an automobile dominated city. So today, though, I'm going to be talking about autonomous vehicles and the application in the third dimension. We're now working on an advanced air mobility plan for the city. So these vehicles are planned to be piloted for the time being, but if you can imagine the prospect of more autonomous low flight shuttles flying around your community or between communities, it's actually not as far away as you may think. Many of the vendors and manufacturers we're talking with anticipate, or they hope to come online, in 2023, 2024. So the city, with an understanding of this and with proposed plans from a local master plan development to open a vertiport in the next year, said we need to get ahead of this. We need to understand this technology. We need to know how it's going to have an impact on our residents, on our community. So we'd like VHB is now leading the advanced air mobility plan for the city. To look at those potential impacts and opportunities throughout the region. So we're engaging with our local government and transportation stakeholders right now, as well as being engaged with NASA on a community partnership to share best practices. So really excited to hear from the rest of the panel and learn what I don't know already and share any insight I may have.
Thank you, Kurt. I have so many questions for all of you now after hearing a little bit more about all the work that you're doing. I did just want to invite everybody who's in the room with us to please, if you have questions, use the Q&A to pose questions. We will be moving to audience questions a little later in the session. We're going to start with sort of a roundtable discussion on some of the key aspects of autonomous vehicle access and equity, but please do use that Q&A to pose questions. Obviously, this is e-mobility, diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's the point of this conference. And so I think it's a good place to start to talk about, why, AVs that feel still very futuristic. I mean, they're not, they are here, as Dave and Kurt are talking about, but why should we think of autonomous vehicles as an important dimension of the transportation equity conversation? And I'll just open that up to whoever would like to jump in first.
I'm happy to tee us off. So from my perspective, I would say that perhaps more so than maybe any innovation in the transportation world since perhaps the automobile itself, the shared autonomous vehicle fleet, specifically how we're thinking about providing service to the public, is really an opportunity to kind of turn our assumptions and understanding of transportation on its head, and provide, at least from our perspective, greater parity of access to transportation. I would say, very importantly, safer travel, both for riders in the vehicle as well as other road users, through kind of better understanding of the environment. I'm happy to dive into that if we want to get a little technical. As well as, more affordable service, which I think opens up a whole host of interesting opportunities around economic mobility, job access, and those kind of channels for growth. And then I think also pretty importantly as well is when we think about autonomous vehicles being deployed electric, and in our case powered by renewable energy, what a unique way to address historic EJ inequities by displacing gas-powered miles. Not just from a carbon dioxide reduction perspective, right? Thinking about global climate change, but really on a granular street-by-street level, every mile that an electric AV can drive is displacing local air pollution that would otherwise be emitted by gas-powered transportation. And as Kurt noted, the form factors of our cities are still so overwhelmingly dominated by gas-powered cars. And at least from our perspective, the AV, especially when truly sustainable and fully electric, presents such a unique opportunity to kind of reimagine how transportation is provided to the public. And those needs really couldn't be greater, given the focus of today's conversation.
I'll jump in next and take this question on. So when we think about why we should think about autonomous vehicles as a mobility option around transportation equity and how that intersects, first I have to think about like the public health impacts from vehicle accidents. So on average each year about 36,000 people are killed in accidents. And so AVs really have the potential to save lives and reduce injuries, as Dave noted. And when you think about the fact that about 94% of serious crashes are due to human error, I mean, it's a no-brainer in the sense that AVs definitely have the option and opportunity to remove human error from crashes, which will ultimately protect riders, drivers, and passengers. And when you start looking at data from the National Highway Transportation and Safety Board, that data says that transition to AVs can really have a huge economic impact, saving upwards of 300 to 500 billion a year. And so when you specifically start thinking about AVs as an important dimension to transportation equity, some of the added additional benefits that would have a positive impact on transportation equity include the following. So first, obviously I stated it would eliminate human error, and communities of color are most impacted by traffic fatalities and injuries. So autonomous vehicles could certainly address this disparity by reducing human error. Then when you start thinking about mobility access, so connecting residents to fresh food. Yesterday at the onset of the conference in our legislating panel, we talked about the social determinants of health and how there's numerous factors that are integrated and associated with transportation equity. One of those is mobility, of course, and connecting residents to fresh food. So food deserts are particularly common in frontline communities. It reduces their access to fresh foods and healthy foods. So AVs could serve as a connection point for residents with grocery stores that otherwise might be inaccessible for their community. Also, when you start thinking about traffic congestion, if they're deployed in some of the most congested regions and cities in the United States, AVs can also help reduce that congestion, which can save drivers about 100 hours per week, 100 hours per year, where they're not stuck in traffic and they could be doing other things. So increasing productivity and saving money and reducing our carbon footprint at the same time. And then there's also opportunities to increase opportunities for access to multi-generation families. So multi-generation families often are found in frontline communities, and they have to share their transportation options around multiple family members. So those older residents that are older family members that may have disabilities, or even younger family members that have mobility limitations, access to AVs, if more widespread, would lessen the impact of transportation disparity for these individuals. And then my last point would be improving public health. So as a public health professional, that's critically important to me, and I think everybody on this panel. So for people of color, particularly Black, Latinx, Asian communities as well, and rural communities, they're exposed to higher levels of fine particulate matter air, and they're disproportionately impacted by overexposure to vehicle emissions compared to individuals in white communities. So overall, access to AVs can really help address some of these inequities that vulnerable communities face, and some of those communities include, the disadvantaged communities, mobility challenged communities, as well as multiracial ethnic communities.
Thanks, Shelley. And Kurt, I'd love to hear from you, and particularly also the space that you're operating in with around AV air mobility. But I do also just want to quickly welcome Greer joining us for the panel. Hi, Greer. Do you want to just say a couple of quick words about your work and where you're joining us from today?
Yes, I will be glad to do so. Thank you very much, Amanda. My apologies to the panelists and to the audience for my delay. Apparently, we need AI technology on how to connect to the platform. But my name is Greer Johnson Gillis. I am the Senior Vice President of System Development and Capital Programs for the Jacksonville Transportation Authority. And I am here on behalf of our CEO, Nathaniel Ford. I am part of the team that is helping to deliver our ultimate urban circulator in Jacksonville. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for joining us. Yes, yeah, the tech. I feel like I could be working from home forever and still struggle with tech. That's ongoing. So, but Kurt, I'd love to turn it over to you and hear your response and why you think transportation or autonomous vehicles are an important dimension of this transportation equity conversation.
Honestly, Dr. Francis and Dave answered this so well. I would just be building upon their points for safety and increase the modal share. So I think maybe we could talk about some concerns that are being thought about and just need to be identified and highlighted. And that's one of those could be for the population that's unbanked and having access to, if there's digital services that are needed to book these AV rides. That could be a barrier towards those populations. I think that, of course, there may be privacy concerns about giving out your information, and overall, the digital divide with vulnerable populations could present barriers for, really the getting penetration of autonomous vehicles, maybe in the areas where it needs it most. But Dr. Francis, I loved everything you said about safety and the concern of that. And so I think that's one of the big items that this could have a transformative impact in to our transportation network.
I think that's a great segue, actually, to kind of now talking a little bit more about the barriers and potentially some of the concerns. I think there are, as Dr. Francis really clearly articulated, as well as Dave, that there's a lot of opportunity and improved access to healthcare and jobs and food and social mobility, and those really important, and obviously safety is huge. So there's exciting opportunities ahead, but I think I'd really love to hear from you all too about what do we need to be happening now to ensure that this process is equitable and that we move towards a more equitable future, with understanding and acknowledgement that we are working within a system that is already deeply inequitable. How do we not build upon that? And mitigate or exacerbate existing issues. So I invite you all, and Greer to please jump in, if you have thoughts about what is it that we need to be doing now to ensure that we do realize these benefits that you talked about.
I'll jump in and go first. So all my good points don't get superseded. But of course, for me, it always starts with community involvement and getting to meet with all of the different stakeholder groups that this is going to affect. So you, of course, want to make sure that you're not having any disproportionate impacts, or as few impacts as you can, particularly on vulnerable and underserved communities. So that has to be the first way we can get about this. And so I'll use an example. In Florida, since we're dealing with advanced air mobility, a lot of people are very concerned about vertiports. Vertiports, are they going to show up in my backyard overnight? And you won't be able to just take this off from your driveway. A vertiport is going to operate very similar to a heliport, but with hopefully a lot less noise. So there is a pretty stringent permitting process that you have to go through in Florida, and that all starts with your local zoning approval. So through that, most communities will do a pretty robust, or they should do a public hearing process that, again, would involve that community involvement and education. Once you get through that, then you can go through the FAA and the FDOT approval processes. But again, it starts from the beginning with working with the community to help them understand what the benefits of something could be, and then also listen to their concerns about what the impacts could be and figure out how to make your project work around it.
And if I may add on to what Kurt is saying, I wholeheartedly agree. You must get the community involved. I think it's also important that you get the right stakeholders involved, a part of that community outreach, as well as getting the right partnership. I know for us in Jacksonville, as we were standing up our autonomous vehicle system, we made sure to reach out to promote equity, to make sure we reached out to 2 communities. One was the disability community, and engaging them so we could get their, not only their guidance, but also their consensus as we move towards the autonomous vehicle network. And we did that through the City of Jacksonville's Mayor's Disability Council and our own Advisory Council for Disability Services. And we really made it a point of including them in the discussions, including them in the design, including them in what the vehicles would look like, what would be the features the vehicles would need to have. So I think that's an important piece as we reach out to the community. But then we also included the first responders. We wanted to make sure we got their viewpoint in this as well. When you talk about equity, they're the ones that really are the front lines to serve in the community. So we thought it was important that they too have a share in this and get their feedback as well. So I think when we think about equity, yes, we do want to get everyone in the community on board. We do want to get those in the underserved communities because we want them to really gravitate toward this. But I think it's important that we don't forget our disability community as well as our first responders.
Can I just reinforce what Greer shared there? I mean, we wholeheartedly agree. I think it's incumbent on industry to first listen when we engage with communities. I think that's absolutely critical. Shelley mentioned this earlier, but we're really proud of the work that we've done with EV Noir in terms of engaging with frontline communities in San Francisco in particular to hear how local community leaders and residents want to see vehicles deployed. And that's, of course, critical, right? In order to not just deploy at, but with communities. I think we've all heard that phrase before. But it's also incumbent on industry to share and educate. And that's a critical part of this two-way conversation as well, because let's not kid ourselves, autonomous vehicles are very new and in many ways for some individuals a concerning technology, right? Both from getting into a vehicle that has no driver. I think it's not a logical leap to say that that's a unique experience, especially when you first get in one for the first couple of rides. But subsequently, the autonomous vehicle as a form of transportation is a pretty radical departure from how people get around today, right? And so we need to not only think about the user experience within the vehicle itself, but also how that vehicle interacts with other individuals, other road users. And that's pretty important to the equity component of the conversation as well. To Greer's point about the disability community, I think, from our perspective, ensuring that you have user groups incorporated into the design of the app, of the vehicle from jump is particularly important, but also thinking about the ways in which vehicles access infrastructure, the ways that the vehicles will do things like use curb space, pickup and drop-offs, right? It may seem incredibly tactical and granular in terms of thinking about those sort of operational constraints, but the ways in which the vehicles drive and interact with other passengers and road users really will determine how equitable the service will be, right? And we'll get into this kind of later on in today's conversation, but I think that is incredibly important when we think about how to ensure equity is integrated as a core design principle today before we're too far down the road.
And I'll jump in and echo the sentiments of my colleagues that just shared. But I think in order to normalize innovative mobility, such as autonomous vehicles, you really have to make sure that you are centering community voices. And in this particular instance, in some of the work that we've done with Cruise and with others, is that you're centering communities that have been historically disadvantaged and not included in these conversations, and that really stand to benefit the most from this technology. And so, as I shared earlier, our team had the opportunity to partner with Cruise and really work with them to guide the inquiry in terms of where frontline communities and other communities that could really benefit from this technology are in the space. So we examine, knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs, mobility gaps and mobility needs, and just how people engage with innovative technology and what's needed to really make this much more normal or normalized behavior around autonomous vehicles. And so we talked about centering community voices, using a human-centric approach to facilitate this kind of inquiry. So working with communities that can benefit the most from this new technology is really critically important to increase awareness, increase comfort, and normalize the technology in a way that we can increase adoption.
I totally agree. And I'm wondering if I can just ask a follow-up question, Shelley, of the work that you and Dave have done together in San Francisco. And if you could just speak a little bit about what that engagement has looked like with some of those communities, and a little bit maybe about what you're hearing from folks as you're talking about this technology.
Sure. So the engagement looked like we contacted or engaged with a cross section of two specific communities that we were targeting. So we engaged decision makers and stakeholders from a cross sector. So whether it was elected officials, community leaders, social innovation firms, community-based organizations and partners, residents, to really get a good understanding of what the cross section of that particular community's needs were around mobility and access. So that was one point. And then we facilitated both qualitative and quantitative approaches to get at that information. So, it's great to have the quantitative data, but then to really tease out some of the real stories behind the data and bring the data to life, it's great to have those one-on-one conversations with people to really get a better understanding of where the opportunities are. And so some of the findings that we learned were really, and just to sidebar, the findings will inform kind of like the next steps, the approaches in terms of like the specific engagement and education that we just spoke, that we just shared that is needed. But some of the findings were things that weren't totally surprising, but definitely were things that will help guide future engagement in terms of one, there's an opportunity to provide more education and awareness about this technology. So we always say messenger and message matters. So having the right message and the right messenger to provide that context, share the benefits of the technology, share how it will impact the community and benefit the community was critically important. Also, community members were interested in electric vehicles as well as AVs as a mobility option. However, they also said that there were gaps in their access to transportation. So obviously, having the right education and awareness program can really help communities understand how this technology can meet their mobility needs, provide a better understanding of the safety of this technology and what has been, what types of safety tests have been facilitated to make sure that when they get in this vehicle, that they will arrive at their destination in a safe manner. So, I mean, those are just a few of the things that we found. I could talk about it forever, and I do want to save space for Dave to add anything else that he'd like to share as well about about some of the key findings in our results.
Yeah, nothing too much further to add, Shelley. I think you covered it pretty well. I would just capstone with, it was incredibly revealing for us that we are often inside of a bubble, right? We're talking here on this panel about AVs, and we're pretty well steeped in the technology and the implications, both from the transportation as well as the policy side of things. But it just reinforced for us that conversations like this matter, and it's critically important to not just engage once, but continuously and iteratively engage with community leaders and residents to kind of better understand how communities want to see the technology developed and how it can serve community needs.
Yeah. And I also will add is that, all of us on this panel in this conference are working in the e-mobility space. And so we're fully steeped in what's happening in terms of the transition. But when you start talking about, the local level and grassroots engagement, folks aren't having the conversations about electric vehicles or AVs at the dinner table most often, based on work that we've done in the space. So it's really important that we start with some basic conversations around mobility and mobility needs, and then introducing this technology, because that's part of the process that needs to happen in terms of really centering communities and engaging and building trust. So we don't want to omit that step in our rush to, infuse communities with all these great technology and multimodal transportation options. So I just wanted to share that, as something that we should really, take to heart and consider that in our integrating into our approaches.
And I will add, if I can, I agree with you, Shelley and Dave, on that front. We found that most effective when we actually did the planning studies around our autonomous vehicle networks. That was important for us to get out, and we made it a point to get out to particularly the underserved communities, because we knew we were planning routes up in that area. And just hearing from them, helping them to get a sense of what this would look like, what this would feel like, and yes, helping them to understand that, yes, eventually we will start out with a driver, but eventually there will not be a driver. So just getting them to education to understand what's going to happen, but really telling them in advance, this is where we're headed and we want you to be a part of it. And it was that, as well as just being able to get out marketing information, advertisements in the media, on the radios about what's coming at the JTA. It's amazing how that resonates with our customers even. They know that this is coming in Jacksonville and they're excited about it, but they also know there's still a lot of education around it. But I wholeheartedly agree with what you're saying. A part of that education is so important.
Thank you. Yeah, I also fully agree. I will just say from my own work that also getting outside of the bubble is important. Sometimes in conversations that I've had with community members, and I just start using the term AV, a lot of people are like asking me if I mean audio visual. So that's, just an important level setting of just where we're all at. Not everybody is spending all of their time thinking about this. I do want to ask, I think we've talked about the need for equity and how do we get to, how do we ensure that it is embedded in the rollout? I'm curious about your thoughts about to what extent you think it's been embedded in the process, part of the process of the development and rollout of AVs thus far, if it has been at all. And where do you think the AV industry needs to improve on equity at this stage? Kurt, do you want to start us off on that one?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So from the perspective of, again, advanced air mobility, because this is very privately driven for the moment, I would say that maybe equity has not been on the top of the vendors and manufacturers' minds. They're looking at getting their FAA approvals. They're looking at getting their vertiport leases and construction. They're really kind of a startup. So they have a business mindset, and that's okay. So it's probably not top of mind from the private perspective. And that's why the city of Orlando, understanding that, wanted to make sure that they could create a more proactive regional transportation plan where the city could bring the stakeholders together to act as a kind of a roundtable with the private industry so that these issues, this conversation could be had. So I think we're still so very early in the process from advanced air mobility that equity hasn't been really at the tip of the conversation, but that's why we're having this great webinar today to make sure we illuminate it.
Thanks, Kurt. Maybe Dave, I'll turn it over to you. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think building on what Kurt just shared, it's important to be deliberate, right? In terms of how industry is thinking about equitable rollout and development. Beyond the community engagement side of things, it's an important nuance and sometimes lost in the conversation that fleets, specifically AV fleets, have a little bit more control, right? And in our case, a lot more control over where the vehicles go, and where they serve and where they pick up and drop off individuals and riders. And so that's really, really important, is to be intentional with how you think about deployment of vehicles. That's kind of from the commercialization side of things, and it's a little farther down the road, right? We do have vehicles on the road today. We're approaching commercial deployment, but we're not quite there yet. That being said, I think it's important to recognize that there are steps that industry should take today to incorporate equity as a core design principle. And I'll highlight two programs in particular that we've launched in the last year and a half, that I think kind of really speak to how at least Cruise wants to raise the bar for how industry approaches equitable deployment. First program is called Cruise for Good. This is something that we launched in April of 2020 as a result of the lockdown from COVID-19. We redeployed, at the time, the entirety of our fleet to start partnering with local food banks, two in particular, SF New Deal and the San Francisco Marin Food Bank, to provide nutritional assistance and meal delivery to food insecure households across San Francisco with our autonomous fleet. Since April of 2020 to today, we've delivered, I think it's over 1.9 million meals. We're about to hit 2 million meals. Over 80% of those deliveries have been to households in low-income zip codes as well. And another little plug here, because we are fully renewable and fully electric, we've been able to offset, I think it's over like 90 metric tons of CO2, as well as local air pollution that would have been emitted if those deliveries had been done in gas-powered cars, right? And so from our perspective, this is a really unique way that industry can both, serve a nascent and extremely challenging public need, right? Which after the pandemic was tremendous lack of access to food, especially for low mobility households, for low income households that may have relied on things like public transit, and those lines, obviously were temporarily cut as a result of the lockdown. So that's kind of a unique way that our AV fleet at least has been able to plug in and use equity as kind of a defining principle. And the second, I'll be brief on this so other panelists can jump in as well, is a program that we launched earlier this summer called Farm to Fleet. This conversation, obviously it's very important to talk about racial equity. I think that's critically important, but this particular program, Farm to Fleet, looks at the urban-rural divide, which is another element of equity, of course, especially when it comes to transportation and electrification. Farm to Fleet, we launched in, I think, August or July of this year to source renewable energy directly from farmers in the Central Valley. We were able to find two family-owned farms, one called Sundale Vineyards, the other is called Moonlight, that had invested in solar panels and were looking to sell some of the energy that they were generating. And so we kind of saw this as a unique opportunity to maintain our renewable commitment, but to source that energy very intentionally, creating real economic opportunity and a sort of like supplemental non-farm revenue for family-owned businesses in California's Central Valley, kind of putting together these two very iconic industries, right? Tech and AVs, and then agriculture, right? I would say probably pretty indicative of California's economy, but oftentimes you don't see them on the same sheet of paper, so to speak. And so, that's another really interesting way of thinking about how a centrally managed autonomous fleet can incorporate other definitions of equity, but in a way that still, I think, serve the public good.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Dave. Some interesting initiatives that Cruise is working on. Shelley or Greer, would you like to add anything to this about, how what we've seen thus far in terms of equity being embedded into the rollout of AVs?
Sure. I think I'll take a step back, a few steps back maybe, and just think about in terms of the workforce and the economic development side of the conversation is in terms of exposing more diverse communities, diverse students to careers in AV and EVs. So part of the challenge is that we currently see there's just not a lot of diversity in the space. One of the reasons that we have this conversation so that we can highlight best practices, but exposing young people to careers in this space is critically important. One of the programs that we've been facilitating, and obviously we've made some changes to it because of COVID, but we implement a K through 12 STEM program to expose young people, particularly young people in vulnerable frontline communities, to career paths in e-mobility, whether it's AV or other aspects of e-mobility. There's an opportunity to really invest in our next generation of workers so that they have opportunities to inform what AV looks like with that equity lens, with thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the approach. So that's a different spin on the approach to infusing equity in the AV space.
And Dr. Francis, I love that idea because that's something we felt that was needed as well. And we at the JTA, with our automation and innovation team led by Bernard Schmidt, we did the exact same thing. We set up a STEM program for K through 12, and we actually host classes to come out to our test and learn facility and learn about automated vehicles, and even have summer camps for that purpose. But then we also wanted to think about, when we talk about equity, that's the generation that will be coming. But what about the generation that's already in place? For us, when we think about the transit workers and the transit operators, as we start to transition to this new technology, or not so much new anymore, how do we prepare them? So we're also giving thought to workforce development and how do we prepare the current workers to be prepared for e-mobility. And then last but not least, we want to make sure that this is a space for your small, minority, and women-owned businesses all around the country, even around the world. This is a great industry for them to be a part of, and we want to see more of them there. And so we want to make sure, and we're doing it through our first procurement process, to making sure that we are requesting that those businesses come first and foremost in the work that we're doing. So we're looking at it holistically, not just with the workforce generation, but even the small businesses that can really create a strong economic impact.
That's great. And thank you so much for starting to touch on the workforce component, because I think that's obviously a really big piece of this conversation around what this transition to an AV future looks like. And actually, clearly, I think we're hearing that there is understandably quite a lot of concern about what the workforce development impacts of this transition might look like. And so I think Shelley and Francis, especially, or sorry, Greer, apologies. You've already started to touch on this, but I would like, and I've started to see some questions in our Q&A that really get to this, but I think it's really important to talk about, like, how do we ensure a just transition for workers, people who are employed in the transportation sector today, and obviously, as Shelley was mentioning, how, creating those job opportunities and helping, with STEM programs, train people to be ready to take, have jobs in the AV industry as we move forward. So I'm just going to put that out there for additional comments because I think this is a really important topic.
And we hear it all the time, Amanda. For us, it's getting many of the members who are already a part of our bus operator fleet involved with our automation and innovation team. So they could actually come with our team to see the AVs, to see how they're put together, to see how they're maintained, being a part of our test and learn facility as well. But then we also partnered with Florida State College at Jacksonville here to set up curriculum and work with them to set up curriculum. So not only for the new workforce, kids coming out of high school, going into college, but even our own workforce being able to share in some of that curriculum. And I think that's where you have to start. You have to lay the groundwork for them so that they can participate now, but also get the training that they need to participate in the near future.
I'll jump in here at this point. So I love the information that Greer just shared about their public-private partnership. And so one of the things that I was going to talk about was that we talked about, obviously, there's the K through 12 STEM program. There's reaching the colleges and the universities, particularly the two-year schools, the community college and technical programs. And there's an opportunity to infuse more resources at the high school level and bring back some of the technical. VOTEC was what they called it when I was in high school, which was probably 100 years ago. There's probably some other fancy name for it now. But definitely the idea is to bring back those training programs, because a lot of the jobs that we're going to see as part of the investment in infrastructure as well as in clean and renewable energy won't require a college degree. So there's opportunities to really train folks now, as Greer shared, to get them ready for this opportunity, because we know it's coming. So we know the delivery and the heavy truck drivers and the bus drivers, rideshare drivers, we have the resources and the tools to prepare them for this transition. So why not provide them with the education, the training, the entrepreneurship skills, so that they can shift their skill set and be better poised and positioned to accelerate their economic opportunities. And so that idea is where those public-private partnerships, those relationships with communities, and to have how we've been centering communities. So now we have these good working relationships. We've got the trust built. And so this is a time where we are going to lean into those public-private partnerships, where we're working with community colleges or the technical schools, municipalities, to really bring back those opportunities for technical positions and exposing more audiences and communities, particularly those who are in vulnerable communities, keeping in line with the theme of Justice 40. So making sure that frontline communities have their opportunity and their place in line at the front of the line, as Secretary Granholm said earlier this afternoon. So definitely with the passing of the infrastructure bill and then the current Build Back Better bill that is being debated, there's estimated to be about 2.4 million jobs by 2025, with additional millions of jobs coming. So we really have a huge opportunity to do some transformational workforce and economic development programs to really make sure that people are positioned for these new employment opportunities.
Dave, did you want to jump in and share about how Cruz is thinking about this?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of it will sound a little bit repetitive because Shelley and Greer hit on some excellent points, but just to add a few from our perspective, autonomous vehicle deployment, I think in particular, will be disruptive, right? And as your question kind of hints towards, from drivers to vehicle maintenance to manufacturing. And if that transition isn't really conducted with an equity first or justice first design principle, then the reality is that it could very well disrupt, disproportionately certain communities, including communities of color, lower income communities, that often make up a disproportionate share of employment in things like automotive, repair and maintenance, manufacturing, things like that. But at the same time, as Shelley was mentioning, I think there's probably like three main areas that actually kind of present sort of a virtuous circle in terms of how AVs, especially when electric, can advance employment opportunities. The first is sort of the vehicle manufacturing and assembly side of things. The vast majority of components that are required for an AV, including the Cruise vehicle, both today's Chevy Bolt and our Cruise Origin in the future, are wholly unique to the vehicle itself, right? Things like LiDAR sensors, things like advanced, miniaturized radar for the vehicles. Of course, the actual ADS or onboard computer that makes the decisions and interprets data, right? All of those components need to be manufactured. And because they are so unique to the vehicle itself, those are dedicated, highly specialized workforce members that we need to work with to develop and manufacture those components. So that's kind of one area for growth that, as AVs continue to be deployed commercially, I think we will see grow. The second area is specifically around how fleets operate, right? We're going to need a lot of maintenance and calibration for our vehicles, right? This is not an Uber or Lyft type platform. It's not an individual taking their own car in for, let's say, an oil change. Cruise and others in this space like Waymo and Zoox and Nuro, we are all responsible for maintaining our own fleet's health and ability to serve passengers or provide delivery service. And so what that means is we need dedicated staff to clean sensors on vehicles, to ensure that, again, like LiDAR and radar and cameras are able to discern the world in a highly accurate way. And so that requires another highly skilled set of tools, of knowledge and know-how to be able to maintain that fleet. And you can imagine it very similar to how an airline operates today, right? Where they have certain hubs with techs who are there. And Cruise, for our part, we provide skills training for our autonomous vehicle technicians, including subsidizing certification for ASE, Automotive Service of Excellence, which is an accreditation that an individual can get for auto maintenance. And then lastly is really kind of what Shelley hit on at the end, which is the clean energy transition. It's a little bit more ancillary and adjacent, but I think is really, really important. As more AVs are deployed on the roads, especially when they're electric, they're going to need more electricity, and we should be sending the right policy signals to make sure that that energy is clean. And so you can imagine a whole other work stream of jobs being created around solar panel installation, wind turbines, and of course, all of the EV charging infrastructure necessary to support those vehicles, apropos of the infrastructure package that was just signed by the president.
That's great. I know we're getting short on time here, and I want to make sure I've turned to at least some of the great questions that folks have been asking in the Q&A section here. We've talked a little bit about the workforce development components, and it's really interesting to hear what you all are working on with that. Shirley asked a question that I think is interesting, because I think we've seen some of this, and I've seen it in some of my work as well, about if you've experienced, in the community-based work that you've been doing, have you experienced any backlash either from government or residents, even after communication and involvement? And if so, how did you deal with that?
Yes, I can talk to that. I would say backlash per se, but I would say that we did get some concerns expressed from government officials as well as some citizens that felt that this was, my words, pie in the sky opportunities here. However, one of the things they all said to us at the JTA was that they trusted the JTA, and they trusted our CEO, Nat Ford, that he would not steer the community down the wrong path. But by means of that, we were able to get back out to government officials as well as the citizenry by means of just town halls, if you will, and even in this pandemic, face-to-face or mask-to-mask town halls, just to share with them, okay, let's discuss the project, let's answer your questions, let's talk about the equity and the mobility piece and the accessibility piece. Those are some of the things that everyone states that they would like to see improved with public transportation. So here's one of the ways we feel we can deliver that for the residents of Jacksonville by means of the autonomous vehicles. And that really did help by us having those conversations. And it was all of us. It was all hands on deck from all staff involved in this, all the way up to our CEO, so that everyone realized that we were committed to this because we saw this as the benefit for the community. It wasn't just a sexy project. Accessibility, mobility, equity, we would be able to deliver on those things by means of this vehicle and putting in a transit system with these vehicles.
So I'll offer that, yes, we've also experienced, we all have backlash and communication. We hear that we're so pie in the sky from a advanced air mobility perspective. Why are we spending money on this as a city when we have homelessness, we have affordable housing, and just our regular surface transportation needs to be improved upon? And again, we are trying to be proactive because these companies are coming in, whether it's a Lilium or a Joby or a Kitty Hawk, and they're each individual puzzle pieces that are going to end up on the landscape. And what we're trying to create is the top of the puzzle box, so you can see all the pieces together, and that way you can understand how this will fit in and integrate with the community, rather than the community having to integrate with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, those are great points to make, and certainly part of the conversation, which is that, there's all these other things going on. Is this where we should be spending our time and energy? And also finding this right balance between, to your point, Kurt, as well, that, there are these dueling pressures potentially where it's like the technology does feel like, well, it is in development, it is coming. And so how do we sort of manage this space and make sure that we are also doing engagement and preparing for it in a way so that we can do exactly what we've been talking about here, which is that ensure we have more equitable deployment. I would love to just, in the last couple of moments here, I've seen a few questions that I would think kind of hit on a little bit of the theme around infrastructure and AVs and EVs, and the equity components there of where does this infrastructure go? And so I'm curious, I'd love just to hear some thoughts on that component about the actual physical infrastructure piece that may be required.
I'll say I'm hoping that my fellow panelists are so successful with AV deployment that we can use all of the parking garages and repurpose them as downtown urban vertiports to move people around. And it'll take a system like that to really, get us off of the combustion engine paradigm that we're in now. So many different pieces working together.
I'm happy to jump in here too. I think there's a lot of synergies for autonomous vehicles, specifically when we think about the electric infrastructure required to support them. There are some near-term challenges, right? As I hinted at least for how Cruise is operating our fleet, we have historically done sort of co-location of vehicle maintenance with the chargers, and that requires depots, right? Sort of behind the fence installations and sites that have historically precluded the public from charging. But taking a step back, we've recognized that that's not really sustainable, both from an onboard cost perspective, but also more importantly, as we think about sort of the policy implications, we want to make sure that the public has as many opportunities to charge as possible. Because when you think about it, we still got a long way to go to ensure saturation for EVs, human-operated EVs. AVs, when electric, can also help democratize access to clean transportation. Why not synergize those? And so we are exploring a lot of opportunities and partnerships with traditional EV charging companies to co-locate charging for Cruise with charging for the public. And it's kind of a unique twofer, right? You get to kill two birds with one stone, only do the cost of sort of like one site upgrade to get the right electrical infrastructure in place, and make use of the very limited space in our cities, San Francisco probably being the top of that list, right? Or pretty high up there, while at the same time encouraging broader adoption of sustainable transportation, be it from a personal vehicle or in a shared AV capacity.
And I'll jump in quickly and add that in thinking about the infrastructure, if we don't do a good job doing the research as well as the education and awareness about the transition and accelerating AV and EV, there'll be nobody in these vehicles. We'll have great infrastructure, great vehicles and technology, but people won't feel comfortable utilizing it. So we have to do a better job of making sure that we take the research, we're doing the right research, taking the research findings, and as we learn on the Cruise project, developing education and awareness campaigns and materials so that people want to utilize this and see this as a community benefit. The worst thing is to have all this great technology and then nobody's utilizing it. So that's definitely something that we definitely want to consider as we continue to iterate on innovative mobility options.
Well, agree or please, yeah.
And very quickly, I will close out and just saying I'm excited about the new bill that just passed because it creates opportunity for all of us to take advantage of more investments in our infrastructure, for us, state of good repair and what have you. But this is a great opportunity to build the infrastructure that's needed. We talked about the smart technology that would be needed for this, but at the end of the day, it's still an infrastructure project and construction that will be needed. And we're excited about it because it will impact us positively, create jobs, but more importantly, promote safety. And I think that's something we all want at the end of the day. So very excited about what's about to come for all of us.
Well, I think that's an excellent note to end on, Greer. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dave, Kurt, Shelley, Greer, for joining the panel today and having this discussion. It was great speaking with you all. I feel like I could talk about this for hours, but it's time to move on to some networking. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today and adding your Q&A and your thoughts into this discussion. I hope you have a good rest of the conference.
Thanks,
Thank
folks.
you,
And thank you, Amanda.
everyone.
Thank you, Amanda.
Okay.
Take care.